Hello, and welcome back to Bitwig. Today's modular concept is note signal flow. Now, we think about signal flow a lot, and we often think about it as audio. When do certain effects get added? And the order that they occur can either ruin a sound or turn it into something kind of pleasant and nice. Additionally, it's not just what is present and how it gets added, but maybe when it's all handled on the same level, it's just too much. And there might be a nice way to sort it out so that if only a portion of the signal is being affected, then we can do something different and interesting. Now, thinking of note signal flow is not incredibly different. In this case, these notes being held are being spit out one by one because there happens to be an arpeggiator. If we were to turn all that off, it's just single notes at a time. But if we wanted more than that, maybe our multi-note here could take the single notes, turn them into chords. Now, turning these into chords and then feeding them to an arpeggiator has a certain effect. And turning the arpeggiator output into chords would be very different. Perhaps relevant in some cases, but just a fundamentally different choice. So these consequences of note signal flow, the order that things occur in, and how they can totally shape your sound just from the note chain is what we're going to look at today. Now, in Bitwig, of all the device types, there are instruments, which tend to turn notes into audio. There's audio effects for processing audio, and yes, note effects, whose primary concern is processing notes. And that includes the 5 different kinds of expressions that exist within notes in Bitwig. Pitch can change over time. Timbre, pressure, gain, panning, each of those can change over time for individual notes. So some of these different devices address it. Now, there's even more categories inside of here. There's the standard MIDI business for filtering by channel or bringing in program change messages, etc. There's routing for saying, I want to grab notes from any source within the track, within the session, a different track, a different point in a track, et cetera, to route things around freely. Containers, which we'll explore a little bit for saying, do we want to stack and processing things parallel? Do we want layers where we just do individual things happening at a time? But the note effects category is kind of the big one here, where there are 21 different devices, all managing notes in different ways. So starting to think about this, it helps to try to categorize things and shape our way of thinking, because 21 is a lot to manage. So here's a few different ways of thinking and ways to try to approach it. The first attempt I took was to say, okay, let's think about what each of these devices is doing. And it turns out of the 21, about 8 of them have some relationship with randomness that is totally different from device to device. About 11 of them, half of them, have some focus on pitch, either processing the pitch of the notes coming in or filtering which notes it's going to process based on their pitch and making a discrimination in that way. And even more are involved with velocity, which actually makes sense because changing the pitch of a note can be pretty extreme and harmonically unfriendly sometimes. Changing the velocity tends to be a lot more subtle. You know, our ear is a lot more sensitive to pitch than loudness or timbre. So velocity is kind of a safer place. But this doesn't really help us categorize our devices so much. It just gives us a sense of what is possible. So a different way of thinking is the idea, I kind of labeled it here as when. Now 10 of these devices just keep the timing of the notes that come in. So you could kind of think of those as flat processor devices. A note comes in, something happens to it, it's either continued or stopped, it's either transposed or not, some elements or its expressions are either randomized or not, but the note is still happening in the same time, in the same footprint. Now there are some devices that move the note. That could be humanizing the time or the feel. That could be a simple note delay device to typically offset one layer of a sound to happen later than others, or even quantize to group notes together and make them happen more in line with each other. And then there are still other devices, 5 devices, that actually have the potential to make new notes. The arpeggiator just says, what am I holding down? Now we're going to strum through each of them at a time, give or take. Or, forgive the analogy, there is a strum device. But all these other options for saying, okay, notes are going to come in. I have all these different ways of shaping their echoes or their dribbles and turning new notes out of it. Now, this is a little bit more useful, but if we're thinking in signal flow terms, I think the how they're actually working and how they're processing notes might be the most useful way to look at it. So there's a lot fewer devices in this category. Let's just look at a different visualization of the same thing. One category is that single notes get turned into chords, and that's the multi-note device. It's going to come up a few different times. There's a middle category where single notes are potentially turned into more notes. Now that's where it dribbles and creates more echoes. So these are all variations on the idea of note repeat, basically. And then there's a special category, like strum and arpeggiator, where many notes happen, but then the device tends to output only one of the notes at a time. So these are kind of some useful ways to think of it. So let's look at a few of these devices in particular in the context of Bitwig. And when we build something musical around it, we might get to some interesting results and see some of the other devices in action. So this bit we were hearing at first, what's interesting here is the hi-hat that's playing. It's just one note, a bar long, repeating its 16th notes via the note repeats device, which is kind of its own instrument. A couple of these are just fully playable because they touch so many avenues. So we'll look at note repeats first. This is interesting because it has a probability. It's saying each individual repeat has a 74% chance. Or if we put it to 100, okay, we got 16th notes. And if we weren't randomizing parameters of the device, like a good patch would, then it's going to be a lot more static than what we hear right now. But even just that 74%, you really start getting the feeling that there's a pattern going on. Now, fortunately, there are other ideas of pattern built in to note repeats already. So let's turn this up to 100% for a minute. The burst mode is saying a bunch of notes are going to happen in a row. I can say how long is the pattern and how full it is, so I'm filling it about half. And then how many of these notes actually have accents as well. So I can say for these few non-accented notes, how quiet do you get? So I've already got a shape there, and it's kind of interesting and not a bad way to work. Now, finally, we've got this Euclid mode that I kind of like, which is doing some Euclidean, applying in the rhythm domain, some Euclidean patterns for rhythms. Now, this is pretty good overall. I'm just going to remember two things because I'm working in the sequencer. One, I don't have to modulate this to 30-second notes occasionally to get interesting patterns. I've put a couple notes in here happening between the 16th note. So that's close to the 30-second note interval. And when I activate them, so 85% of the time, I'm going to get some 30-second notes happening here. And another 50% of the time, I'm going to get some 30-second notes happening here at the end. Now, this, to me, feels pretty good already. Just one last idea about patterns and loops and that whole idea, anti-loops, if you will. Yes, a pattern of 8 feels very regular. It's landing exactly where I expect it. It's ending exactly where I expect it. I have a free hand right now, though, to change this number without changing the 16th note interval. So I'm not going to break the rhythm, but I could turn the pattern into something very different. Now that feels interesting and pretty good to me. So let's just keep that going for some of our other examples. Now, Dribbble was another one of these devices that can generate new notes. It's really a form of note repeat. In this case, it has some physics. It has some dampening so that each bounce will slow down over time. If I play quietly, I don't bounce so hard. If I play hard, I bounce a bit further. Now, if you really want it to be a note repeat, you just get rid of dampening. No dampening. And this pattern will keep going until dampening comes back into the system, and then notes will kind of drag out. Now, this is fine, but to me, I want to do something a little bit more musical with it. I want to play a line where only some of the notes end up with dribbles and I can hold the other notes out. So maybe if I want only some notes to be processed, maybe note filter is a good idea. I've picked a range here kind of in the middle of the keyboard. For letting me target certain notes. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is grab these two note effects. I'm going to say group, Command G on my platform, and now these are the ones that are going to bounce. And if I were to take this layer and duplicate it, the question is, what do I do with all the other notes? So now I've got a second copy of this layer. And these are not going to bounce because I'm going to remove the dribble. And with that note filter that was set to a certain range saying keep those notes, on the other layer I'm going to say only get rid of those notes. So now I have an exclusive relationship. Only this range will get sent to dribbles, and anything not in that range, outside of that range, will just get sent through like normal. So again, like with our audio example, maybe only some of the values should get processed, and we've got filters, we've got layers, we've got ways to deal with it. So that's kind of fun. Now, another one of these devices that is really an entire world into itself, like Note Repeats was, is Echo. What is Echo doing? Every note, again, it's a repeater. Every note's going to come in. In this case, I'm saying, well, make it repeat 4 times, and then a whole section on what to do with the repeats. So right now I'm randomizing time a little bit and then just flatly stretching time out. So the notes will get further apart with each repeat. And I have a little micro pitch device here for letting me kind of tune. I'm doing a bit of a historic mode, nothing too extreme. One thought with micropitch and things that are defining the pitch of each individual note, I really want this to come last. Because if it comes first and some kind of transposition happens along the way, then my notes are not all going to be put into the same scale. They might end up in different places. So micropitch is last, and it's also a nice visualization for seeing which of these notes is happening. A little sparkle. Does it have an infinite switch? Of course it does. Are we going to do that today? We don't have time for that. But what else is on here? Now, this is interesting. We were looking at pitch ranges and being exclusive in our previous example with dribbles. This one has an idea to say, well, transpose all the notes that come in, but only if they're between certain pitch ranges to begin with. So again, it's got a lot of concepts built into it. These are pretty safe up here. But then, oh, it started fine, but then I'm just playing C and F today, folks. Ending up on these black notes is not going to be in key so much. So how could we manage that and process it? I like that the notes are changing. I like that it has some life of itself. So maybe the key filter device, which is saying, I'm listening to the notes coming in, and then in this case, I would like to constrain the notes into C major if they didn't fit there already. Let's push them hard enough to just stay on the other pattern. So. Everything's staying in the right place and helping me out key-wise, which is nice. I could even modulate this back and forth if I wanted between the different chords. But just for one moment, because I was being silly, of course we have time for infinite time. Who wouldn't have time for that? Now, when I call notes signals, yes, part of it is all the different streams that are coming through Bitwig on each note. Let's bump that down a little. So the new notes are closer together. The longer they get stuck in the repeat machine, the further apart they get. Unless I wanted them on each cycle to get closer together. And closer together. And... ooh. That is a very different mellotron. And if you don't believe that notes can be signals, maybe you'll trust me now. Moving on. Ricochet is a different kind of repeater that's kind of just saying, hey, we're going to bounce off the walls and off each other and make notes re-trigger. Maybe in that note is a signal theme. We could even say, well, let each individual note have its panning reflected in its position, and its timbre expression, which can be used freely in the device, go ahead and move when it goes up and down from north to south. One thing that's fun here is just to play some harmonies, and then with this kind of sound where it's decaying over time, the notes that re-trigger become the harmony you heard most recently. So it's kind of like, even if I'm holding down notes, different chords come alive over time. So either for a performance or just compositional element or a little bit of chance, that can be interesting. One thing that's even a bit curious, I'm going to take this instrument and put it down to being monophonic. Only one note will sound at a time. A lot of times if you're using hardware, if you're using CV and modules, Eurorack, whatever, they tend to be monophonic as well. So in this universe, now I can play polyphonically. I can play a few different notes, maybe some bass type notes, and whichever one hits last wins. So I'm kind of playing with the idea of polyphony, but turning it into something monophonic. And again, one, it would work with hardware, but two, it's just an idea of shifting harmony that's a lot of fun. So if I were to play a few notes, only one is going to win at a time. And again, we're doing pretty open harmonies today, but it's a fun idea. Now, finally, one last example with a little bit of a twist. I've got a sound, and it's got an arpeggiator. It does what we would expect. I hold down a single note, and it'll cycle through that note and pitch variations of it, just nice octaves here. As I hold more notes, it just becomes a bigger word bank for cycling through those notes. So that's one fun thing with this whole row of pitch transposition is I'm already making that pseudo anti-loop. I'm already making notes that are changing over time in an interesting, kind of predictable, but different sort of way. Now, notes as streams, and we're talking signal flow, the randomized device is here to target all 6 of the expressions within notes. Velocity is the one that only gets updated at the beginning of the note. The rest of them can get updated throughout the note. So if I look at this example-wise, if randomize comes before the arpeggiator, each individual note I play will get randomized, but then it will keep those values if I'm just playing one note into the arpeggiator. So let's hold one note. You see how the panning is fixed and how the timbre and pressure, which are getting modulated over here, are just staying on one note. I play a new note, it'll end up somewhere else. Because this is the entry point where only a single note is happening. Now, this is going to be a little bit more interesting if every note coming out of the arpeggiator is randomized, at least in this case. So now we should get some dancing. All right. Now, that's kind of fun. And again, with signal flow, we just have to realize where we have different notes existing and where they don't. Now, beyond that, I want to use the arpeggiator for the wrong purpose. What we're hearing right now is the normal use of an arpeggiator. I play notes, I hold them, that's the source material, and I'm just going to poke around and create arpeggios out of them. Well, I want something that just makes it easier for me to play the keyboard. So let's change the timing of notes with the note length device, which says each note that comes in is going, yes, it'll trigger on press, not on release. That's a different option. And we're just going to make each note last for a quarter note. These are 16th notes, so most of the time I'm just going to trigger 4 of the arpeggiator notes for each note that comes in, no matter how long it is. Now, that's kind of fun, but it starts falling apart when I play more notes because it's super monophonic, which is the nature of an arpeggiator, but maybe not the nature of what I want. So let's try it as it is. So that's okay, but it's not the layered thing I'm wanting. Now, arpeggiator's not supposed to be polyphonic. So let's trick it. Let's make it polyphonic. What am I going to do? I'm going to go ahead and group the arpeggiator, which will put it into a layer device, because I'm really on the way to say I want a note effects selector. Now, the layer says everything's going to get triggered at once. The selector says only one of these are going to get triggered at once. Now, how do I get more notes out of an arpeggiator? Well, maybe I just decide to make more arpeggiators. So now I've got 4 different layers, and pleasantly with selector, it has these different modes. Round robin, simplest idea. For each new note that comes in, send it to the next layer. Which means if I have 4 arpeggiators, they could all be running at the same time. Ah, that's kind of what I was looking for. So now... Now, I'm not a suddenly better keyboard player, but the arpeggiators are all keeping me on the grid lines, cleaning up my timing, and creating something nice out of it. If I minimize the single layer and just say, well, after the selector, which is sending out all those notes, yeah, maybe it's another good time for key filter, and maybe I'll pick one for a different reason. Maybe I'll pick G, just instead of C, to say, well, let's just keep the slightly unsafe notes out of it. Let's keep F out of there, and it's just going to make my life a little easier for overlaps. Filter mode's going to say drop them if they're not the proper notes. So now, suddenly I can play piano. I'm just hitting the keyboard, which is perfect because look, playing the keyboard, it's kind of like speaking English. Nobody's supposed to do it perfectly. We're all just supposed to do it well enough so that we can communicate the idea we have. So, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.